Hi, good day, everyone. I am Kevin Farmer. I am the Deputy Director at the Barbados Museum and Historical Society. And I want to welcome you to our webinar that is looking at Obeah and having a discussion that seeks to de-mythologize, destigmatize, and have a rather informative discussion on what Obeah is. In the past as well as today. We're joined by Doctors Tara Inniss, John Hunte, and Deryck Murray, who promised to provide us with interesting presentation, after which we will move into a question and answer section from our guests. I think for Q&A, persons can either come on and ask questions or post their questions in the chat. This webinar is being recorded to be used later on the museum's Facebook page, as well as our YouTube page. Let me now introduce our speakers for today. Dr. Tara Inniss is a lecturer in the Department of History and Philosophy at UWI Cathedral Campus, Barbados. She's the director of the UWI OAS Caribbean Heritage Network. Her area of focus includes the history of medicine, history of social policy and heritage, and social development. In 2002-2003, she received a split-site Commonwealth PhD scholarship to study at the UWI and the University of Manchester. In 2007, she completed the Masters in International Social Development at the University of New South Wales in Sydney. Dr. Inniss has served as a delegate for the Government of Barbados on the World Heritage Committee. She's also a member of the Barbados research teams for UNESCO's World Heritage Property, Historic Bridgetown and its Garrison, and a new nomination that will explore the industrial heritage of Barbados, the story of sugar and rum. She currently sits on several committees for the Barbados World Heritage Committee, the Barbados Museum and Historical Society, and the Association of Caribbean Historians, where she is the secretary. Welcome, Tara. Dr. John Hunte is an arts practitioner, activist, and teacher. He's armed with a diploma in dance, theater, and production from the Edna College of the Visual and Performing Arts in Jamaica, a BS in dance from State University of New York College at Rockport, an MFA in Performing Arts Management from Brooklyn College, New York City, and a PhD in Cultural Studies from the University of the West Indies, Cathedral Campus. Dr. Hunte teaches dance, cultural studies, and gender studies modules at the Barbados Community College and at the University of the West Indies Cathedral Campus on occasion. As a practitioner, he still works with academies, colleges, and programs across the region. Various places include, and his identities, as he wears many hats, being the executive director of the Barbados Dance Project, Inc., artistic director for the Barbados Dance Theatre, and member of the Barbados Landship Association Advisory Committee. Dr. Hunte is an ordained minister in the Caribbean Regional Spiritual Baptist Community and currently serves as chair of the Council of Spiritual Baptist Churches of Barbados. Welcome, Dr. Hunte. Dr. Deryck Murray, having completed his international baccalaureate after winning a full scholarship to the Lester B. Pearson United World College, Dr. Murray gained his undergraduate degree in biology at the University of the West Indies Cathedral Campus. He later pursued and completed his PhD at the same university, during which time he won a split-site Commonwealth Scholarship to conduct research at the University of Manchester's City Centre for the History of Science, Technology, and Medicine. His work examined and compared the history and philosophies of African and European knowledge systems as well as their use to forge lifeways by African descendants and fight emancipatory rebellions across the Caribbean. Currently, he is director of the private research institute, the Center for Hybrid Studies. Dr. Murray also lectures at the University of the West Indies Cape Coast campus on science, technology, and medicine and society, Caribbean civilization, the history of medicine, gender, and African Caribbean religions. He also supervises graduate students in cultural studies. His work is very much involved about understanding cultural mixing and creolization, which he has termed Tukantology, and is in fact being increasingly used as a framework for researchers. As former head of the government's Commission for Pan-African Affairs for the last 30 years, he conceptualized and implemented numerous Pan-African initiatives, including the Mabalozi, a Swahili word meaning ambassador program. Dr. Murray was a central figure in guiding the development of Barbados' National Cultural Foundation and its National Task Force on Reparations. The latter served as a catalyst for the formalization of the Caribbean's institutions to research and call for reparations under the region's block of nations known as CARICOM. Welcome, Dr. Murray. Today, I'm more or less leading off the discussion by framing the questions that we will be examining. And what is Obeah? Or what do we think Obeah is? The fact that it has been used as a catch-all term to describe a systems of beliefs, which then have saw it being used both in medicinal and social cultural practices. What I wish to share with you is what happens when we move away from taking a look at Obeah within the archive, but seek to explore it as it relates to our material culture. At this point, I just want to share our screen. Hopefully everyone can. Can everyone see my screen? Yes. Now, whereas the other presenters today will be taking a look within the archive and within existing practices, my focus is really when we speak of Obeah beyond documentary evidence, what else is there that can allow us to identify and understand what Obeah is, what the spiritual, medicinal, social, cultural practices. In the case of Barbados, I wish for us to look at two sites, and these are one is the only known and excavated communal enslaved burial ground so far discovered in the Americas, and that is the Newton Enslaved Burial Ground. This burial ground is located in the parish of Christchurch in southern Barbados. And at this burial site, there are two burials whose material culture or lack of material culture, and that's just a fancy word for artifacts, that have been interpreted by researchers to point to a belief system, prestige in one instance, or a certain lack or a certain degree of ostracism in another. These two burials are known as burial number 9 and burial 72. Burial number 9, which is in fact one of the few mounded burials at Newton. It's one of two. Is the only mounded burial at Newton where there is one solitary interment. And that is the solitary interment of a female body, which is buried in the prone position. Prone meaning that the person is buried face down. Now, according to some West African practices, as well as historical data, the burial of persons in a prone position was normally left to those persons who you believed one had to control in the afterlife so that they would not return to cause harm, to interfere with, or interact with the living. And that's burial number 9, or mound 1. The other, burial 72, is one of the more highly decorated burials at this enslaved burial ground. There's a lot of grave goods associated with this burial. Here are some of the items found with that burial. A pipe, which some persons have interpreted to be of West African design, which is completely different than all of the other European design pipes found within burials on that location. Personal adornment in the form of a bracelet, as well as a necklace that was worn by the person, comprising a series of both canine, teeth, animal vertebrae, shells, traded beads, and more importantly, an agate bead. That agate bead, which has been traced to a place of manufacture in India, in Cambay, denotes a particular level of prestige and perhaps what we might deem to be personal wealth of the individual interred at that burial ground. There are some who've interpreted these level of grave goods not only to the social status of the person, but in some instances have pointed out that the person might have been an Obeah practitioner. They've used the North American term shaman. They've also used term as a doctor, which some of the etymology in Obeah seeks to point to that perhaps being one of the terms used to derive the practice in English. The other site that I want to speak of is Trent's Plantation, which is located on the west coast of Barbados in the parish of St. James. And the excavation of that plantation, where we'd actually found for the first time an enslaved village, it is located on the hill above Trent's, running parallel to a gully. And a gully in Barbados is basically where the roof of a cave has collapsed, leaving behind the surface of that cave, which allows people to traverse it above ground. There was found a cave within that gully system. And when the cave was excavated, one found a cache of iron knives, as well as other iron implements that had been sharpened. But then one found this object, and unfortunately I don't have a better image, that of the bottom of a glass bottle, which had then been repurposed and refiled. And it was actually stuck somewhere high in the roof of the cave. Of course, suppositionally, one then asks, is this a cultural, spiritual use of the cave? And that question still remains because we still don't know enough of the practice. We have some understanding, or there have been some oral traditions passed down. Maybe today's discussion will shed new light. But when we talk about the material culture and artifacts, we don't have a lot. When one takes a look at what are termed to be Obeah laws, starting as early as 1760 in the region and continuing to the present day, in some instances, those objects associated with Obeah are mentioned within law. Over time, the identification of items disappear. One can suppose that any object could be used depending on how the practitioner wishes to use it. But what is interesting that in today's society, only 4 Caribbean countries have actually taken off of its law books any legal action to be taken by someone practicing Obeah. And in most instances, there still exists not only those laws about the practice, but also laws about the dissemination of information about the practice, which is most interesting. So at this time, I wish to leave you with that, a short look at what might be deemed the material culture and how it might be utilized. And I would like to now call on Dr. Inniss for her presentation. So thank you for listening.
Hi, thanks, Kevin, for that introduction. I'm just going to share my screen. Hope everything works out here. Hello, good evening, good afternoon, everybody from Barbados. A bit rainy here, but we're surviving. Okay, so I express my thanks to the Barbados Museum and Historical Society for organizing this online forum. I look forward to the presentations of co-panelists and the active engagement of the wider audience. Kevin started out with the question, what is Obeah? Well, I think my co-panelists will likely discuss more of the etymology and origins of the word, as I discussed it with one of them. But I won't get into too much depth here, only to say that Obeah is known to researchers as having multiple meanings across the region and in the diaspora, to largely describe a set of practices and beliefs around the supernatural forces that influence the lives of peoples and cultures in African-descended societies in the Atlantic world and modern Caribbean. The term and the beliefs and practices that come to form our knowledge of Obeah is West African in origin and has medical-religious dimensions that are not uncharacteristic of other African religions and spiritual responses found in the Caribbean, such as Voodoo, Vodun, and Santeria. However, we have to accept that this is a term that is heavily loaded and charged with meanings that have largely been shaped by the colonial experience. This warps the identities, rituals, and belief systems of Africans to serve the interests of dominant white European Christian cultures that sought to dehumanize and destabilize the knowledge systems of Africans in the Caribbean, so that they could take maximum advantage of their free and later cheap labor, while also controlling the fear of mass uprisings. According to Jerome Handler, the experience in the Caribbean, especially in the English-speaking Caribbean, subjected Obeah and its practitioners to a highly punitive legal framework that existed well after emancipation, with some territories only recently discussing the repeal of Obeah laws, which Kevin mentioned. Its active suppression, criminalization, and concealment have become part of its meaning, and interestingly, the negative forces that its practitioners were often accused of controlling have come to form the largest part of our historic and popular understanding of the term. Like many of the contradictions of our colonial legal system, we were actively told that something did not exist and was relegated to the superstitious, but was in fact highly dangerous if suspected and required maximum punishment. And as I often explore with my students, for something that does not exist, we all seem to have a healthy fear of it and somehow understand its forces on a fairly visceral level. Culturally, we may not be conscious of it as we daily dismiss something that cannot be explained, like how a woman get a man or how a man get a woman, as being Obeah, or why having an interest in plants and their healing properties is Obeah work. And I bring to your attention, obviously, the very well-known Calypso by the Mighty Sparrow, Melda, or Obeah Wedding, clear tones of Obeah here. So it's entered our popular culture in this way. We have shared a knowledge of something that is highly fragmented in our consciousness, but yet has survived Barbados's destructive and reconstructive colonial experience through creolization, a rigid system of law and order, the onslaught and dominance of Western knowledge and medical systems, negative gender and racial constructs, and the destruction of our natural environment, as well as a migration experience that took this knowledge further into the diaspora. I'll discuss briefly where I have encountered Obeah in my own research, into some of the healing and protective traditions of the enslaved, especially as it relates to children and their care. First, we must note that Obeah and its practitioners have existed in Barbados from the early colonial period and survived, as Griffith Hughes notes, even among the children of Africans who are born and bred up here. I was very interested in this in my PhD work, in understanding how children, if they survived, were cared for in Caribbean slave and post-emancipation societies. One of the places you sometimes read about these encounters with Obeah is in the life of enslaved communities, was particularly with pregnant women and children. So I'll go through a couple of examples of that. Since infants especially were believed to be both part of the physical and spiritual world, several negative perceptions were held about their influence on the health of their parents. Parents and community members watched all aspects of a child's experience of coming into the world very carefully. Many of these examples were taken from other territories and periods, but they demonstrate how infant and child survival were bound in the spiritual life of the enslaved community. Children's illnesses could be cured when the spiritual well-being of the child, family, and community was addressed. In addition to the application of several herbal remedies, rituals were also performed to ensure enslaved children's health from the moment they were born. Parents who embraced the protective power of this ritual knowledge also recognized the power of individuals in their community who could master it. Enslaved parents were fearful of the influence of the spirit world, spiritual world on their children. Frances Lanigan, there's another quotation here about Frances Lanigan, the Irish-born wife of an Antiguan planter, reported that she knew one African-born woman who had the power to talk with Jumbis or spirits. Parents who suspected their children were being troubled by spirits frequently called on her to assist them. Although spiritual healers were generally revered in enslaved societies, their domain over both the good and evil aspects of the spiritual world also made them the target of suspicion. M.G. Lewis, a planter in Jamaica, reported that breeding mothers, or so-called breeding mothers, on his estate accused a suspected Obeah practitioner named Adam of, quote, poisoning a particular spring from which they were in the habit of fetching water for their children. Adam was suspected simply because he was seen near the spring. Richard Madden, another European observer, an Irish-born doctor, records another case in Jamaica where a convicted so-called Obeah man was imprisoned for practicing on the life of a Negro child. He was seen putting some bush, so-called bush, into his pipe and blowing the smoke on the child. The child took, and I quote, alarmingly ill, and the child's father pursued him and forced him to remove the Obeah. After performing the rituals, the child improved, and he had apparently learned of the herbs and rituals from an elderly man on the estate who was suspected of poisoning his master. I think this case is very interesting because what it shows is that even before he was arrested, he was actually encouraged to remove the obeah through a ritual practice. So it's interesting to see it actually being reinforced here as well. In these examples, albeit recorded by European observers, which should caution us in their use as reliable, unprejudiced sources, they do tell us that obeah was entrenched in Caribbean slave societies. It regulated the lives of the enslaved and was determined to have special application for protection in the spiritual life of the community. But they also tell us more about the power of the negative gaze of the European observer, who was quick to emphasize the more negative aspects of these beliefs than acknowledge the positive forces of the beliefs, the believers, and the practitioners. But we can also see that the practitioners were initiated in rites and rituals that allowed communities to heal and to cope with the oppression of plantation society. However, these examples only describe through bias what is observed. We really cannot penetrate all of their meanings in an African slave society. We both know and don't know at the same time. And I think this has characterized our understanding of obeah today. Deep secrecy and unspoken knowledge are encoded in the ways in which we discuss obeah today. And I think we really have to come to terms with how we represent African knowledge systems in the region. One question I will throw back to you today, and I hope that we can explore this, is why or how do we continue to acknowledge and disavow African spirituality and religion in our lives today? So I'll end there, Kevin. I hope I covered what I needed to cover. Over to you.
All right, thank you, Tara, and you did. At this point, I'd like to hand over to Dr. John Hunt, and then followed by Dr. Deryck Murray. Dr. Hunt.
Thank you, Kevin. Thanks for being on this panel and sharing it with Dr. Inniss and Dr. Murray. And thank you all for who have come on to hear us talk about obeah. For me, I'm coming from a place of performance. I'm a performing artist. I'm coming from a place as an academic of research. I've done research as a practitioner, and also as someone who is immersed in spiritual practices, both as a spiritual Baptist, which is an indigenous form coming out of the Caribbean, and also as a result of that, engaging in investigating other traditional practices. So currently engaging in other investigations of other practices, and also on the continent of West Africa. So I'm coming at it, I'm processing as I talk, and I'm hoping that I don't come across as a pretender. Part of my interest, or part of my journey, has become the decolonization of what we experience in the Caribbean from an African perspective. A lot of what I have experienced, or what I've come to know about myself, comes through the lens of our learning, and a lot of that learning doesn't really capture the vast richness that is part of my experience in the Caribbean. And then for the few times I've traveled to Africa, my experience as it connects to my experiences on the continent. And so when I engage in this notion of what obeah is, or what it proposes to be, it seems to go as a conflict to how I experience life as a person engaging in spiritual practice within the Caribbean space. So I found that the description of obeah as spiritual and healing practices developed among enslaved West Africans in the Caribbean a very good context to not only talk about what came over when my ancestors came over into this space, but also because of the way that the enslaved colonies worked, to demarginalize, discredit, to diminish anything that came over as African. It also speaks to the way in which this practice, or these practices, have continued in spite of the way that they were treated. So I would have, in one of my provocations, written an article, which I think is the reason why I'm here, which would have talked about embracing obeah and decolonizing religion. And then I would have talked about a few things. I would have talked about the notion, for instance, that Obeah is given power to influence the course of events, which to me isn't different from how we would consider Western prayer or religious rituals, where we are inviting this quote unquote Holy Spirit of God to create a new spirit within me, to renew and to restore, which seems to be consistent with all practices and all religions. So what makes Obeah different is, I guess, it then comes down to racial and geographical constrictions. So it's interesting that when we look at things that happen that are causing us favor, we call them miracles, but then we tend to always decry the things that we think of negative as curses and ascribe them to things of Obeah or of African nature. So that was one of the things I wanted to provoke. I also wanted to state that, we live in a state of cultural and spiritual denial, whereas we privilege the Eurocentric and the European and those things that we learn and that we are conditioned to learn. Anything that comes outside of that, we cry down, without much investigation. We try to reason how religion has been co-opted to regulate our identity as Africans. And particularly in that regard, the way in which religion has been set up for us, for a lot of us in the Caribbean, a lot of us who follow the organized religions, is the way that it sets up in deference to our heritage. That being African and being Christian then are polar opposites. And I think that is problematic, because then we have to live this embodiment in the way we construct our lives in the Caribbean. Conversations around spirituality in the Caribbean often resonate around the legacy of enslavement and the current issues of race and representation that suggest that the region is in an identity crisis. Pretty much, if you take on that lens of what is the criminalization or the demarginalization or the diminishing of everything that's African, then you can perfectly understand why we are in the crisis we are in any sphere, politically, educationally, medically, etc., because we have not given or other practices the opportunity to be acknowledged, or we haven't acknowledged our ancestral or African heritages in the same way. And I think that is the main crux of what we are grappling with here, where many years after emancipation, and with the notion that is behind us and that we can move forward, what would it take for us to really acknowledge the atrocities, perpetuate a reality that they would have come to know for themselves? So it would take a very confident faith leader, or any leader actually, to apologize for those atrocities done in the name of his or her religion, and to argue for spiritual reparation for the sake of peace. Some of us are in a position, let's say, as faith leaders or as groups, to acknowledge that there is a need to embrace what is uncomfortable, what is to acknowledge and therefore apologize for these atrocities, not only in the ways that we would have benefited from it, but the ways that we would have been co-opted to act out these prejudices on others, right? We should also seek to make forgiveness for those people we have wronged, and then to unmake the systems that have set up these binaries, to correct the injustices, to undo, to create, to remake, and to restore that breach. I think that it is a necessary step. However, as easy as it is to say, it's difficult to do, because it requires that we unlearn, that we unthink, that we unsee, that we unperceive, we unintellectualize. At the very heart of this is where we can then embrace those systems that have always been here. I believe the more that we get to that space, that we can begin to embrace and embody, and also inform how we can move forward in the future. And some of these clues appear when we look at the Afrocentric and indigenous practices that we are engaging in. When we think about how in these practices the intention is to connect and to align with ancient practices or ancient rites and rituals in order to be enlightened, in order to fulfill your purpose. And that requirement in two things would occur. from indigenous ministries from across the North American, from across the American continent. We have indigenous ministries canon, Jenny Doctor from Canada, who would state that we need to create a safe and sacred place to heal. You know, before we can become effective, before we can set up what is healthy in our lives, we need to create that safe space for people to acknowledge the uncomfortableness, to acknowledge the hurts, to acknowledge the emotions, to acknowledge where our egos are in place, to heal those and to get those out of the way so we can allow ourselves to be informed by spirit or be informed by the other intelligence that we may possess as a result of giving those entities the space that they may need to enter. And then we need to understand the history. We need to understand what had happened to us, or what had happened to our people, or what happened to our ancestors in terms of what is the national, what is the state, provincial, local, personal histories or policies that would have impacted on our ability to really acknowledge and even celebrate that aspect of ourselves in the same way that we may acknowledge and appreciate what we claim to know, what we think that we know now. So we need to look directly at racism. We need to look directly at the way we internalize that in terms of how we act out those oppressions on ourselves and others. We need to acknowledge what is a internalized white superiority that we sometimes embody when we take on leadership. We want to be able to deal with what is the interior space where we are fighting against ourselves and wrestling with ourselves and disembodying ourselves in terms of how we function. And then we need to find a way to deal with it in not counter-aggressive ways, but in a ways that shows the shed of those emotions and then the willingness to be humble. One of the systems that I'm embracing is the Dagara system that is located in parts of West Africa, including Burkina Faso. And one of the notions that is offered from this space is the awareness of positioning the egotistical material self in a position of prostration before the great divine ancestral wisdom, which is doing so given the opportunity to humble ourselves to the lowest level that it manifests itself through our bodies and into the world as we walk this earthly plane. So for me, this is requiring us to really, not necessarily dismiss, but to put aside the things of our intellect that we have learned, the things of our emotion that we feel, and things of ourselves that we hold most dear, and allow a repositioning of what is information that's coming from another place, and to embrace that place may be a place that we were always in touch with, but we never really acknowledged. And that by giving that acknowledgement and respect, we can function in a different way. But it requires that we do the work, because we can talk the talk, but we don't necessarily do the work. And that work requires that we engage in ritual, we engage in community, we engage in acknowledging that all of us are in this space, and our connection with another person is going to offer us this opportunity to learn about ourselves and to learn how to deal with ourselves and to learn how to create space for others to join in that space. So this engagement forces us to work towards inclusivity, to speak about the we rather than the you and I, to speak to reconciliation, how to bring everybody back into one accord, into alignment, to rehabilitate, how to heal and how to readdress and how to move together, and transparency, how to be honest and open with our own uncomfortability and be able to present in a way that it can be received and that it can be dealt with. Now we talk about the systems either in our Western or European organized religions or even our African religions, but we know that we are always going to be embracing that tension which comes from the way we ourselves are connecting to this at the particular points and times that we connect with it. The notion that we have to think about how to restore and regain creation, is not necessarily something that is going to happen by numbers. So we shouldn't look for a huge shift, or that we should look for consensus in order to feel that as if we're moving forward, or to feel that we have to compete or to dominate. But it is this matter of addressing self and addressing that journey and noticing that we're connected not just to others, but also we're connected to others in terms of what is our spiritual or what is our other callings and understandings, and allow them to inform how we speak, how we act, how we form, how we move. from a spiritual Baptist perspective, this is very engaging to me. We think about being guided by spirit, so that it's not just us alone in the world or us against them, but it's us moving as one. It is a very, like I said, a daily discipline that we get involved in, because often we find ourselves butting against what is the ego, what is the emotion, what is the intellect. So what I want to suggest that underneath all those things that we find ourselves distracted by, there's other contexts that may be clashes, that may be competitions, that may be complexities, that may be complications, contestations, or contradictions. And I'm suggesting that because we haven't really addressed it before, that is the spiritual and healing practices that come out of Africa, and that is what is Obeah. If we are able to embrace that and address it, I find that for myself, the conflict then becomes that of vexation, according to Ecclesiastes, vexation and vanity, that those things which we hold dear and those things which cause us tension are the things which we can address in our lives as we begin to move forward. And I think that as we do that, we are beginning to embrace that part of ourselves that I believe, and I will say that I believe because, and I'm getting evidence of, that is Obeah. And I would suggest that, as each of us in our own way, we begin to address that, even more so than the material or the what is or what the name means. We all have other connections, other intelligence itself can be. Thank
you, John. Thank you, John, for that. I'm assuming you're finished. Okay. All right. Thanks, John, for that. And taking this in a totally different perspective, that of the person exploring I don't want to say the alternative, but the other side of spirituality away from the Eurocentric one to which we have been engaged in for so long. At this time, I would like to invite Dr. Deryck Murray, who has really delved into the subject and has done a lot of research and written on this. So welcome, Dr. Murray.
Thank you very much, Kevin, and thank you to the Barbados Museum and Historical Society. And thank you, Tara and John. As per usual, I always enjoy I think I see Professor Jerome Handler and Professor Kenneth Bilby. And I want to first of all acknowledge their work, because at the time that they were trying to demonstrate the positive for Obeah, there were very few academic links identified with it. And I would have taken some courage at that time. And it served as a foundation for my work. It gave me it gave me a direction and some guidance. And in terms of on African knowledge systems, I wrote to him and he took me time out to send me materials. And as a postgraduate student, demonstrated what it means to be in an academic community. So I give thanks for that. And I want to speak today about the origins of Obeah and its role in rebellion. And I hope you're seeing the screen. And I'll read as much and as quickly as possible so I don't forget anything. And then you can always question me after. So, Obeah as Igbo spiritual technology. Obi, today known as virtual context, and its plural, Obeahs, are mentioned by the white Barbadian Thomas Waldo as early as 1710 in letters to James Penn, an apothecary, a member of the Royal Society of England. this is Handler's and Bilby's work. The terms were probably in common use among the Africans at the time. And some historians suggest that the term originates from the negative twi, Efik or Igbo words that translate as evil magic or witchcraft or sorcery. And that was the general thinking in the academy until Professors Handler and Bilby persuasively argued that the original term was either neutral or positive, as it is today in Suriname, where it was taken from Barbados. Handler and Bilby, they offer the Igbo word, Obeah, which is the word for Igbo priests and Igbo diviners, D meaning husband and Obeah meaning master, or D meaning husband or master and Obeah meaning wisdom, as the origin for the word Obeah. I want to offer another possible origin of the word Obeah in Barbados. There's perhaps no need to look for a word in Igbo that was corrupted, because the idea is that the original word Obi was corrupt, and the word that we have Obeah now was the corrupt form from the word Debia, which would be priest. So we perhaps don't need to look for a corrupt word, because there's actually a word in Igbo that's actually spelled the same way as the original Obeah was spelled, which is Obi, O-B-I, that does exist in the Igbo language. And that word is used to identify any central organizing force or principle in Igbo language. In Igbo thought, the term Obi literally means heart. And diverse functions as well as emotional and moral attitudes. Obi is the seat of center of virtue and vice. The heart is said to know, to hide or tell information, according to Okere. In Igbo architecture, Obi is the male meeting house of an extended family. It is often the conceptual or physical center of domestic Igbo architecture. It can serve as both a domestic and spiritual space. It is also where the emblems of the ancestors are kept and sacrifices performed. Obi is also the word for king in Igbo. Nigerian Ifa priest, legal practitioner and author Olusegun Okidaro agrees with me on this. He states that among the Amechi people of Igbo land, every morning the head of the family goes to his Obi, a special sitting room of the head of the family, to perform certain rituals in front of the symbol of his Obi or personal spirit, or what the Yoruba would call perhaps his Orisha or his Ori, that guards the priest. He identifies Obi with a sacred ritual space or room, as well as a personal guardian spirit of the head of the family. Whether as a physical space, human, physical or mental attribute, spirit, or social ordering, Obi is a central organizing force. Further, from the evidence, it would appear that the early African meaning of Obi in Barbados was probably more as a guardian spirit, in the same way that Orisha and archangels are guardian spirits. It follows that there would be several of these spirits, and it makes sense, and it makes sense of the plural references found in the work, in the Walduck letters, because sometimes he speaks of Obi and sometimes he speaks of Obeahs. So I want to touch on Obeah. So that's the root of Obi, and I'm suggesting that it is you could think of it as a central organizing force of the Igbo people and used in that way. The reason I'm emphasizing that is because I think that when we do this work, we should do it to also inspire new ways of thinking philosophically. And one way of thinking, we have a tendency to look for foundations and reduce philosophical ideas to axioms and assumptions and single assumptions. And that's one way of doing philosophy. Another way of doing it is to look at a central organizing force rather than to keep looking for foundations to explain our reality. So I want to touch on Obeah for freedom fighting. And of course, I'm leaving out many things. I'm going very quickly. The ability of Africans to work in secret was noted from the time of 1675, the 1675 Barbados Plot. Coromantee men planned for at least 3 years without being discovered. Not even their wives knew the details of the plan. Although there is no direct evidence of how the oath was administered during this plot, betrayal by Fortuna resulted in the death of several sages, one of whom, when he was about to be killed, observed the important ritual of calling for a sip of water. At the time, it was noted that this was a custom they had before they revealed any secrets. So he was about to reveal the secrets about the planned rebellion, but first had to reverse, it appears, an earlier oath that forbade the revelation of these secrets. The taking of these oaths was serious business with deadly implications if broken, as seen by a court exchange in an unrelated case between an enslaved African and the magistrate. The magistrate asked, "Are you Christian? Are you christened?" The African said, "Yes." He asked, "If you take the Bible and kiss it and swear falsely, what will happen to you?" The African said, "I will die, I will die." The chairman asked, "And where will you go to then?" And the African said, "To heaven." The chairman said, "Well, suppose you swear falsely, what will happen to you?" And the African said, "Me will purge and my belly will swell." And he repeated that several times. Now the chairman, the magistrate, not on oath, and told him so. And he said, "Yes, master, no well, belly will swell." And the chairman desired that the oath should, he should be examined without administering the oath. Because you see, while taking an oath for the English meant being faithful to the truth, the same ritual for an African meant being faithful to a secret. And the African at that time may have undergone the grave dirt oath, which was popularly performed by African sages in the Caribbean, and which was similar to the Ashanti ritual known as drinking the gods, as explained by Rattray. So the plot of 1692 was also in planning for 3 years before discovery. On this occasion, it was clearly reported that the sages were bound by a fearsome oath. The most detailed evidence is found, however, next door in Antigua, and this is the most detailed evidence of oaths being taken or Obeah being practiced, was found next door in Antigua, where we glimpse the sequence of initiations during the formation of a secret society for war. The evidence is provided by Commoner Martins during his testimony at the trial of John Sabi, a participant in the alleged 1737 conspiracy. Commoner said he saw John Sabi take the oath at his own house 3 Sundays running so that he can head, and that is to kill white people. As in Barbados, this ritual work was often done on Sundays. The Obeah sage Sekundi initiated John Sabi and Kwaku on the first Sunday. On the second Sunday, Johnny drank the health, or was initiated to Tony. Sorry, Johnny initiated Tony, who in turn drank the same health to initiate Caesar. The testimony continues as follows. The first Sunday, Sekundi was there and asked Johnny whether he would join him in what he was about. And Johnny asked what it was. And Sekundi said that they were going to destroy the white people. Johnny said, "I'll join and kill as many white people as I can." Of course, that may have been, remember that we're reading testimony as recorded by the white witnesses. And I suspect that that's an exaggeration, but anyhow, Sekundi and John color engaged several people. Oaths bonded the men in secrecy. Johnny. More details are available for Sekundi's initiation. Sekundi was the apparent leader of the planned rebellion, but as was the custom in African societies and repeated across the Caribbean, warrior leaders were partnered with oracular sages. Sekundi was initiated by an Obeah man himself and was sworn not to reveal his identity. One person gave the following evidence. I saw this Obeah man at Sekundi's house after I waked at midnight. I found him and Hunte's coffee there. Sekundi gave him a shaqueen, a bottle of rum, and a Dominique cock, and Kweku put Obeah made of sheep's skin upon the ground, upon and about the bottle of rum, and the shaqueen upon the bottle. Then he took the cock, cut open his mouth and one of his toes, and so poured the cock's blood over the Obeah, and then rubbed Sekundi's forehead with the cock's bloody toe. Then took the bottle and poured some rum upon the Obeah, drank a dram, and gave it to Sekundi, and made Sekundi swear not to discover his name to anybody. It appears that once more the involved ritual was performed. It appears that once the more involved ritual was performed for one person, he or she could then continue building the secret society through simpler initiations. I want to come closer to the present with the Bussa Rebellion to show how Obeah was involved. The spiritual dimension of the 1860s in the evidence and has to be inferred from the fact that up until the end of the 18th century, African ways of knowing and making were still dominant. In addition to the 46 years after Jamaican planters sought to curb legally the insurgent activities of Obeah specialists in response to their 1760 rebellion, the Barbados Assembly still felt secure enough to ignore these sages and even boasted about the island's peculiar stability, to the point where Dixon was prompted years earlier to offer the sociologically based analysis of Barbados as a Creole society to account for the submissiveness of the Blacks. As a result, in the Barbados 1806 law, parts of which were copied directly from the Jamaica Act, which explicitly mentioned Obeah, they chose to adopt only those sections that dealt with the loss of planters due to the death or injury of the enslaved, labor at the hands of Obeah men and women. The Bussa 1816 rebellion, however, jolted the formerly comfortable assembly into full awareness of the new reality that Barbados was not immune to uprisings. The 1806 law was deemed ineffective, repealed and replaced by the 1818 law that targeted those Obeah sages who shall willfully, maliciously, and unlawfully pretend to any magical or supernatural charm or power in order to promote the purposes of insurrection or rebellion of the slaves within this island, or to injure and affect the life or health of any other person, or who willfully and maliciously shall use or carry on the wicked and unlawful practice of Obeah. So up until that point, the Barbadian planters did not seriously consider Obeah to be a threat. Actually, the practice of the ritual practice of Obeah until that rebellion. The only significant change from the 1806 law was the recognition that Obeah sages promoted insurrection. It is difficult to conceive that a Black Barbadian community in 1816, still separate from the whites and self-contained for the most part, with leaders who did not take seriously the craft and advice of Obeah diviners. The oath, obligatory among Blacks preparing for war throughout the West Indies during this period, was probably taken by these fighters at Jackie's house, one of the leaders. They gathered on Easter Day, a significant spiritual day for Blacks in Barbados who had assimilated some Christian rites. And Mingo administered a ritual where he gave all names according to the evidence. This name-giving ritual was important for conferring power during African initiations and was also done at Christian baptisms. This ceremony reveals a new African Creole secret society institutionalized among Blacks in Barbados and used to tie or initiate new members just before going into battle. It seems that Mingo played the role of the spiritual advisor to Jackie and was likely an Obeah man. This is the same role played by Obeah specialists in earlier plots. When Robert testified that he passed by Jackie's house and overheard Mingo saying that Sunday night next, they were to turn out and give the country a light, and the country would be as sure to him as the coat on his back. This sounded similar in meaning and tone to Kweku's, a known Obeah specialist, advised to Taki in Antigua when he warned that if they delayed attacking the whites, they would surely win the planned 1736 revolt in Antigua. Mingo's statement sounds more like a prediction after divination than a military strategy. This is not to imply that military strategy was not involved, but it seems that Mingo's meetings with Jackie were for the purpose of counseling him spiritually as well. Further, the influence of Obeah seems more likely if it is accepted that Bussa, one of the main leaders, was born in Africa. He would have been steeped in an African spiritual tradition. Further support for the role played by Obeah lies in the possibility that the party held before the rebellion and which the leaders attended was in fact a ritual feast or a play, as they were called in Suriname and Jamaica. It was observed that nothing could stop Blacks from attending these functions that they were passionate about, and that they would travel several miles after a full day of field work, participate for most of the night, and yet be back in their owner's field punctually for the next day. These dances were likely more than simple parties, although some entertainment was probably involved. It is at these dances that the collective work associated with the rituals that sustain and manifest forces of nature and facilitate collective ancestral communion were conducted. This is why Blacks in Barbados were determined to attend and invest so much energy and time. It is at these rituals and probably several others that important sage work would have been conducted. The pre-rebellion party for Bussa's rebellion was not just an ordinary planning meeting. The ancestors and other spiritual entities and forces would have been consulted. We may also ponder on why Sandy Waterman, another leader in the Bussa rebellion, who was executed, made sure that he was baptized 6 weeks before the rebellion. Obeah leadership and power was in reality distributed among the African sages who would have officiated at the plays, dances, feasts, funerals, and who had specialty trades and positions on the plantation. It was these leaders who used African spiritual technologies to build the secret societies, whose main project was freedom, justice, and equality for the Black population. So the question for us today, are, where are our spiritual revolutionaries? Where are our secret societies? And where are our spiritual forces? And most pressing of all, where is our freedom? Thank you for listening. I will stop there.
Thank you, Deryck, for what has been not only just insightful, but a lot of food for thought. I'm hoping that it will generate much discussion this evening and hopefully prompt us for phase 2. It's really Obeah as resistance. And of course, what makes you wonder is if not the development of the early landship movement is not a continuation of a secret society, as well as other secret societies cloaked within European dress, whether it be at this time, I'll ask if there's anyone wishing to ask questions of our presenters. As have been noted, you use the hand icon to indicate so that we can actually then ask you to ask your question.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you so much for your presentation. This is Janice Lawrence Clark in New York. I have a question regarding Obeah and voodoo. Is there a similarity? Is it the same? And I should say Obeah, voodoo, and Santeria. If you can expound on those for me, that would be fantastic. Thank you.
Deryck, or who wishes to take it?
Hearing.
Oh, thanks, right. It's important to know, and again, Professors Hanlon and Bilby would have pointed this out, that, you know, Obeah is really a catch-all term for what were really disparate African spiritual technologies. In other words, wherever the white planters saw something looking African and spiritual, they would call it Obeah. And so it is not a coherent system in the same way that voodoo in Haiti or Santeria would be. So what really would have been, what we call Obeah today is really a reconstruction of fragments of African spiritual rituals. For those people who treat it as a system, it would have to be a system that was reconstructed from various aspects of African spiritual fragments. But unlike Santeria in Cuba, that has, you could trace the tenets, the rituals, the coherence, the foundations of Santeria to Lukumi and so on in Cuba, and the same thing in Haiti. That's not something that you could easily do, with the exception perhaps of Suriname, where it was taken to from Barbados, where it would be probably closer to the original OB that that Walduck would have overheard the Africans speaking about.
Hi there. Do you want me to speak? I think you just unmuted me. I'm Brent Crossan. I'm joining from Austin, and I'm a professor at the University of Texas in religious studies. And I enjoyed this panel. It was amazing to me. Dr. Murray's etymology seems really groundbreaking, and the idea of spiritual reparations I wanted to ask more about as well. And then the case of the face down burial, I just wrote a book about Obeah called Experiments with Power, and I'll put the link in the chat. And was used in an incident of police violence where the police killed 3 people. The police are basically paid to, and this is in Trinidad, sorry. The police are basically paid to assassinate. And what this incited, and this also I think answers Deryck Murray's question, is that the protests against this police violence, Obeah was a part of the protest, and Obeah was in the most popular chant during these protests. And so there are rituals done in the crossroads. And the burial was a face down burial, but rather than banishing the spirit of the person that was buried, it was actually to keep that spirit around to work for justice. And so I think, I think about this in terms of not using the lens of witchcraft, not using these good evil dichotomies. Who knows what they were doing back then, but in these cases in the present that I look at, it's used for justice and justice making rather than banishing someone who's thought to be evil or a witch or whatever. And so that face down burial was used to keep the spirit around, actually, rather than banishing it. And so I look at Obeah as justice making and through the lens of science. And Deryck Murray's work on the use of technology has really been influential on me for that. So I just wanted to say thank you for all of you. And maybe my question is to talk more about spiritual reparations. I really appreciated Dr. Hunt's talk about that and how that kind of goes along with, like socioeconomic reparations and other movements for reparations. How could that be incorporated in those movements?
Thank you for that, Dr. Crosson. Just taking a look in the chat. The question from Ted Taylor to Dr. Murray: when and how did the more negative interpretations of Obeah begin?
Hi, sorry, Kevin. We actually had Denicia next. Her question, the question was, is it possible for him to share a bit more about spiritual reparations?
Okay, thanks. Special reparations is a very popular term, I think. Well, not popular, it's become very popular around Pan-Africanists. I don't claim to be a Pan-Africanist in that sense, but when I was asked to address last year, there was a conference of Anglican bishops from the South who were in Barbados, and I was asked to make a presentation about the ways in which Christianity was co-opted to enforce slavery and colonialism on African heritage people. The notion of spiritual reparation came up in the way that we, as quote-unquote spiritual Baptists, would have embraced, syncretized, merged, and made sense of our reality by embracing the various aspects of not only Afrocentric spiritual practices and the Euro-Christian concept of spirituality, but also embracing aspects of Hinduism, the Kabbalah, and other Jewish rites, certain Masonic rites in the way that we embody and practice our faith. That this could be a way out for people who are currently wrestling or functioning in a society that is moving away, wants to move away from those strictures, but are still trying to embrace what are the Eurocentric and Anglophone practices in Barbados, for instance, and the Anglican Church. Their struggle to remain relevant in a society that is no longer willing to accept some of the things that was done in the name of Christianity. And so I would have touched on some of the concepts that I would have mentioned before in terms of thinking about what is it that the spiritual leaders need to do in order to create that bridge. So again, like I said, apologize. I mean, the ways that as leaders in society, we almost represent the colonial strictures, the aesthetics. In the name of Christianity, we are encouraging, even accidentally, people to deny being connected with their Afrocentric realities or the Afrocentric heritages. When you think about the written versus the oral narratives that we would have been discouraged from carrying out. You may have a cultural sense of what our practices were like, that would guide us. The way that we would offer our foods, we would make offerings before we would eat them. We would consult before we would engage in a relationship, in a business, and in a marriage. The ways in which we have almost out of culture understand it in one sense, but we don't really appreciate the centrality of it in another sense. Notice that the symptoms that we are experiencing today can be attributed to the legacy of the enslavement that was came about as a result of that, and then confront the ways in which those experiences have reinforced what is racism in one context and what is internalized, the way that we also then act out on each other in other contexts. So when we think about moving towards reparation, we're thinking about how we celebrate all our identities, from racialized contexts, from concepts of gender, concepts of what we think about what is an egalitarian, or even things about identity and orientation. How do we address those that are inclusive, that are transparent, that are diverse, and that engender this sense of justice? I think that we are still challenged with concepts of difference and different. when we learn from all our spiritual faiths that there should be no such thing as condemnation, and that the way that we can start doing that is by really deconstructing or rejecting this notion of colonization and what it has presented for us, how it has functioned in our lives. And I think this is one of the biggest things that we have to address, the notion of colonization and how it still impacts on the way we even construct our realities. We want to be able to privilege what is our intention, you know, if our intention is towards creating this authentic self and embracing that. We want to really examine what is the Episcopalian movement, let's say, in the Anglican faith. What is this movement? What is it about? Is it for the inclusion? Is it for transparency, or is it for division and exclusivity? You want to be able to give African and Indigenous practitioners more central space to be able not only to speak to, but to also practice. So notions around things like offerings or things like various rituals, water rituals, you know, various things that they would do at the beginning of various things, divinations. Not to think about this in derogatory terms, but to really find a place where they can have equal space in the same way that we can celebrate feast days for Anglophone or for organized practices, that we can also do the same for Lukumi or for Santeria or for Voodoo in a way that it is embraced. And then I think that we really need, as a consequence then, to really decolonize, you know, really come to terms with what that would look like within our own communities in the Caribbean, but also broadly as we reach out to that global space, because we are still grappling with very, very rigid and very restrictive and exclusive notions of how we express ourselves. Enforces a kind of dogma that relates, it constricts. And from my appreciation and from my embodying this path that I'm on, that is not the way in which spirit works. Spirit works in a flexible, mutable, and fluid way. With the engagement of possibilities of the how do we get there rather than why or what or where. So I think it's going to require a complete reshifting of how we think and how we function. So that's what I consider to be spiritual reparations. I find that if you do it that way, then the other aspects, the material aspects, the financial aspects, the economic aspects will come into being, because we're approaching it from a different central and not as a binary to fight against. So that's my thinking at the moment.
Althea, I think you had a question for our panelists. Okay, not hearing Althea. The question to the panelists is, what is the status of Obeah today in Barbados? Hi, Althea.
I could venture a comment, and I'm sure that Dr. will venture one. At this point, very much a position that one would take, or I would take, to provoke another understanding of how we are. One of the ways that I reach for it is in terms of how Barbados and life functions, with all its contradictions and all its conflicts and all its contestations in that way. When I think about Jamaica, I think about reggae and Pocomania. When I think about Trinidad, I think about the Carnivalesque and Shango. So when I think about Barbados, I think about Obeah in the way that we may not have a sexual respect, but do have the way in which things tend to happen and the way things tend not to fit together in a neat way, but somehow in the end, things progress. And for me, that is one way to begin to trouble what is this notion of what this way of life is and how it is impacted by the way not only we stand up against those notions, those influences, those energies that may impact on what we do, but also the way in which our histories of marginalization and of diminishing, those fragments also show up in the way we do things. So for me, it's on a philosophical level, but if I now put my mind to deal with it directly, and I look at my own life and how I'm evolving in those particular ways, I get a sense that there is pretty much, like I would have said, a sense of if I understand something, then it is not understanding, it is intellect. So I have to allow myself the moment to embrace information that will come to me. If I think I know, then I'm probably deluding myself from what is actually being present in terms of perception. So I have to be open up to other ways of knowing. And so there is this unlearning of the social codes and mores that I've been conditioned to look at, and then allowing myself to take on spiritual codes and spiritual modes that may or may not have any relevance or resonance to what is happening here. And I would say in this particular case for Barbados, I think people are at various stages. I will want to say more are in contact than they may think, but generally there are very few people who will willingly embrace or even take on the challenge of allowing themselves to be humble so that they can be informed. I don't know if Dr. Murray wanted to add anything to that.
Thanks for that, John. Dr. Murray?
Yes, thanks, Kevin. Yeah, that question about the status of Obeah in modern Barbados or modern anywhere in the Caribbean is not an easy one, it's a fairly complex one. You know, we have a saying about Haiti, for example, that Haiti, well, I don't know the percentages, I'm just guessing what, 65, 75% Christian and 100% Voodoo. So Barbados is maybe, 70% Christian and 100% Obeah, because we practice our Christianity in a very Obeah way. And we practice our spirituality. So for example, you hear Christians say things like, my spirit tells me, or I will leave you in the hands of the Lord, or I will pray it for you. Now, if a Christian tells you that they're going to pray for you, chances are, if they say in this way, I can pray for you, chances are they're not praying for you to get any particular good things. They're praying for some justice because you've done something wrong to them. And the same thing for if they say, I will leave you in the hands of the Lord. They're not expecting the Lord is going to bless you and put you in heaven and give you milk and honey. You're expecting some hardship to come your way. And those are the ways that we think in an African way. And we also still very much, whether Christian or not, very much believe in the existence of spirits, the interactions with spirits, with dreams and so on. So it's extremely basic. But to fully understand it, you really need to understand creolization and mixing. And so, to study this, well, I had to create a different creolization model to what Kamau Brathwaite, for example, created, so that you could clearly delineate three different strands of mixing. There's the ontological strand where we have materials and things and things at hand that we use. There's the ways of knowing, the epistemological mixing, and then there's innovation that goes on all the time. So there's really three different strands and three different levels, and they move at different rates. And even though the things at hand, the materials that we have at hand and the ontological mixing may happen fairly rapidly, because we can, one day you're in Africa and the next day you're in Barbados and you have different trees, plants, and so on to use. the ways of knowing does not move so quickly, or the way that we think, our muscle memory and so on, that doesn't change very quickly unless you are introduced formally to institutionalized learning. And I'm saying all that to say that our African ways of knowing, especially those that are subconscious, those that are not consciously handed down, remain with us and has remained with us up until the present. Part of that way of knowing is treating our spirituality in a very African way. So even though we are Christians and we embrace that, a close examination will show that the way that we go about that is very African. So we practice our Christianity in a very African way. You know, in Antigua, there's evidence that the Africans used to do something called busting the Bible. They would bust the Bible. This is during the period of enslavement, the 19th century. They would bust the Bible. And what did that mean? That meant that they would take the Bible, open it to a section, use it for their rituals and so on. And when asked what was the purpose of that, it wasn't for any Jesus or any heaven and so on. The purpose of it was to confuse the whites, to confuse the whites by using ritual on the very materials that they brought. So that is not a straightforward question. I would say that increasingly, not obey in the sense that the planters have now, have evolved the word, but in terms of African spirituality regaining a foothold in Barbados, there's a growing awareness, a growing refusal to take our spirituality as negative, and embracing in what people would normally call, an embrace of what people would normally call obey. And the other thing is that somebody had asked in the chat, how did it come that obey is viewed so negatively? Well, the reason why I pointed out that for every rebellion leader, for every warrior, for every military leader who was planning an African rebellion, there was also a spiritual advisor, whether it be Boukman in Haiti, whether it be Mingo in the Bussel rebellion. There was always a spiritual advisor next to the leader. And in fact, in Jamaica, they were so clear about this that they had their Obeah laws early. So if you're the white planters and these Obeah priests are always rebelling, not to mention the fact that this is an African system of knowledge and Africans are supposed to be primitive and so on, then clearly it's important to demonize the entire, all African spirituality, because it wasn't just primitive and backward, it was also dangerous for the planters. So that is how it took root, the negativity took root in the Caribbean.
All right, thank you for that, Deryck. I have a question from Dawn, who said, I would like to hear more about the cave at Trent's. Was that also a burial ground? Who was buried there? Only slaves? Well, Dawn, as far as we know, the cave at Trent's was not an enslaved burial space. From the artifacts that were found, spiritual, cultural interpretation, it's more about the cave being used as a place perhaps for worship, or is that the burial of the items, the time frame in which they would have been buried, very much coincides with the Bussel Rebellion in 1816. Now, whether or not the cache of knives and sharpened iron objects were about caching weapons and or using it as a form of sacrifice for a successful rebellion, we're not sure. However, is that the plantation was one of the places on island that was used after the rebellion to send a message from the English plantocracy, to the enslaved Black population that they should not try a rebellion again. And there were certain places where enslaved men were taken and they were hung. Trent's plantation was one of those places. What is also interesting, because we are talking about etymology, when one looks at the place names for that particular area, at one point it was called Ironmouth. Now, whether we wish Ironmouth, because we don't quite know if Ironmouth is a name given by the enslaved or a name given by the English, but if it's a name given by the enslaved, there's then that larger practice of how iron and the smelting of iron and the use, the retooling, the creation of items from iron speaks to an Orisha or speaks to Ogan. So there's that element as well when you begin to look at Trent. And it's one of those spaces where we have material culture that we have to ask particular questions about it and begin to look at it from and through a different lens. I think that's the important thing to note about that particular site, as well as beginning to unpack our understanding, because we did find, they did find the enslaved village and that was excavated. Begin to take a further look at what that says about enslaved life. And I think that's extremely important. There was a question for Dr. Inniss. Are you aware of sacred oral literature or folk tales that talk about Obeah in childbirth or child rearing? Tara, I think that's for you.
Hi. I did answer her in the chat. Yeah, I did answer in the chat, but I thank you for your question. And I did say that as much as possible, as where I found them when I was doing my research, I collected that information, not only from the materials or the documents that we have access to, but also from folk knowledge and especially herbal preparations or practices as they were described by anthropologists in the 20th century, but also botanists and people who work with plants in the region, and especially the kind of ethnobotanical knowledge. I try to collect that as much as possible.
Okay. As you're still there, I guess if you want to say something more about the connection between African spiritual practice and medicine, especially, well, I would say relating to Newton, but relating to that period of enslavement. Was that something that I think you kind of touched on in your presentation, but no one has quite picked it up in the questions that I've seen so far?
Right. I think what I was trying to demonstrate is that, when we think about African relationships in the Caribbean to healing and medicine, it's not really just about like the Western concept of just the body. It's also it's very much about your spiritual protection as well. And that must have been quite confusing for European observers to have this very spiritual and secular approach to the body. That's something that they might not have had a full appreciation for. And one of the things that I have been working on or working with, and Deryck is aware of some of the work we've even done together, is when you read about these instances and how Obeah practitioners of the narrative as informants. So what's really interesting is that you could get several editions of the same, let's say a doctor writing about parasites in Jamaica and how he came, so forth. And it's very clear in the first edition that that person that he gets his information from is an Obeah informant. And then what you end up getting at the end by the 11th edition is that person no longer even exists in the narrative anymore. And I've always found that very interesting, this transfer of knowledge, and how maybe in the Caribbean we haven't seen ourselves as contributing to Western medical knowledge, but during this period we were very much not only the subjects of medicine, but also producing that knowledge. And it's interesting how that narrative completely shifts to take away any kind of power or agency from our own practitioners in the region. So I've been very interested in that process as well.
Yeah. Thank you, Tara. Here, I want to thank the audience. I mean, we've got a lot of questions. We're trying to shift through them at the moment. One asked about the heart man and whether the mythology around the heart man has any connection at all to Obeah practice.
Yeah, I think they were referring to the point that I made about the origins of the word Obeah, rooted in the Igbo Obi.
Yeah.
And the Igbo word Obi means the heart or the center of things. I don't know if there's a connection. Somehow I doubt there's a connection between the two. But the point I was making is that when I said heart, I really meant the word actually means literally the heart, literally, the heart in your body, literally. But it also means the heart of things, the center of things as a central organizing place or idea. And that's what the word actually means in Igbo. And I think that, somebody asked about spiritual reparations. One of the greatest costs to the Africans in diaspora and the Caribbean is that a lot of the knowledge that is necessary for us to develop new philosophies or expand on older philosophies or to have ideas about medicine, holding society together, and so on, we lost much of that information. And we need that information, even with today's technology. We're still grappling with basic philosophical fundamentals. And we are now rediscovering that information. And if we're talking about reparations, that's one of the areas that is in desperate need of repair. Excavating the knowledge that existed and exists within our spiritual technologies.
Okay, thank you. I think the other issue there at hand, as part of that reconstruction and excavation, is perhaps that relook at some of our old histories and practices. You spoke to, someone saying, well, I'm gonna pray for you. But then there are practices like when one sits on a stool, or used to sit on a stool, because they don't really do that anymore, when it was no longer in use, turn it upside down and put it in a corner. And in some places in the region, there's a spiritual reason for doing that. And it's really about the capturing or recapturing of those oral histories and beginning to look at them almost subtextually to understand the reasons behind why that is being done. I have a question. We spoke about the functionality of Obeah today, or we talked about Obeah being practiced today. Someone has noted the use in certain science fiction genres of the force being deemed Obi or an Obi master. One person's asking, when it comes to use Obeah as a major theme in artistic expression, whether books or films, how much license would you say creators have in building out stories that borrow from and build on Obeah stories to create their own mythologies? What should a creator keep in mind when trying to respectfully produce work that borrows from this spiritual practice while not doing harm? I'll let Deryck and others answer, but my only comment there, since people have gotten into the Marvel universe, do you remember Thor? He does have an equivalent, and or more than equivalent, and that can be organic. But I'll hand that over to Deryck.
Yeah, so I want to make it very clear the distinction between the systems, the spiritual systems that have arrived to this point, still fairly intact, or with some modifications like Santeria or Voodoo. Those systems are systems that were handed down and in a coherent with oral teachings to the point now where some are written and codified. Obeah was not that. If you can find an authoritative written book about Obeah rituals and so on, chances are those are rituals that were reformulated, put together from fragments and developed. And so it's there's no straightforward way to say yes. There's somebody's asking in the chat, how do you become an Obeah master? Well, they're clear. If you're speaking about Voodoo or Santeria, there are clear pathways for initiation, development, further initiations, and so on, that anybody can identify, and they're fairly consistent across different spaces. But for Obeah, there's no clear authoritative path because it was not that. It was as Handler and Bilby said, a collection. We white planters saw the collection of anything that they saw as spiritual technology from Africans, and they called it Obeah. So you're not going to find that. You'd have to ask that same question about one of the more established traditions, or maybe even something like Kumina. I mean, they're traditions that were forged and formed in the Caribbean, like Kumfa, that King Gibson wrote about, or Kumina in Jamaica. And those were forged in the Caribbean, but they are, by this time, they have a fairly coherent system that you could point to. How do you become a priest? How do you develop as a priest? How do you become a master, and so on? So asking those questions about Obeah could really leads to a dead end, because Obeah is not the same, is not constructed in the same way as the other traditions.
Okay, thank you. There's one other question. Oh, no, that's a comment from someone asking for when we'll have a part 2, and can we have other subject matter experts from around the region? My answer to that would be yes, and to stay tuned to us, because I think it's something that needs to be explored. I even have a discussion when we talk about particular practices that relates to dance, because given Dr. Murray's discussion of using dances and or festivals or plays in which to mask this religious practice, are there any dance movements that have been masked that speak to that African spirituality? That might be a question, Ifer, but I'll ask John if he's come across in his research any dance practice that speaks to that, and if not, should it be something that we would want to examine and take a look at? We've got about, we might watch 10 more minutes. Actually, we've got 15 more minutes. I'll ask the presenters if Dr. Hunt is going to speak to that, but I'll then ask the presenters to come on and to give their wrap up to the discussion and talk today. I see John on the screen. Is this in response to movement?
Well, to your point, I think that we as a Caribbean people, or we as people, are in a process of trying to archive something that is called. We will look for functional aspects or aspects of the movement that speak to the particular intent. But to say that something is indicative of a particular aspect or a particular practice is yes, it's like a yes or no answer. There's certain aspects that indicate specifics in terms of geography, specifics in terms of heritage, specifics in terms of understanding. And then there are certain things that are allowed to develop because of the innovativeness or the creativity of the people in the space, responding to various things. So like as a spiritual Baptist these days, we are very much impacted by the social media. So almost every presentation is recorded in real time, and you're seeing shifts in design, shift in clothing, but there are certain rooted aspects in terms of characteristics of movement that we can identify from an Afrocentric space or from a Caribbean space, or that would indicate in the ways that people perform these particular roles at particular points. The different roots, ROUTES, that impact on how we embody our practice within this space. So what is more important to me is that the frequency of people's ritualistic practice. So the idea that in a worship service or in a practice that you're involved in things like singing and sounding and clapping and moving beyond the written or the word to try to really embody and to embrace and to be involved in and to be immersed in and to then experience in a visceral way that aspect of your spirituality that in a way that doesn't function necessarily in a Christian church or in an Anglican or a Catholic church, or it's not encouraged in certain aspects. It doesn't happen. It's not encouraged in the same way. I think that is more important thing. And once you are immersed in that and you're beginning to appreciate the environment, then there are certain codes of understanding that come to you, or that you are able to relate with on a level that you can begin to understand and interpret and communicate at that visceral, embodied, and transformational level. This is not something that you can necessarily speak to, although we do try to do it academically, or we can show through images, or we can teach in classes. But this is something that you come at from an interiority, from embodying and then being able to express. So I would encourage people who are willing to embrace that to really take that on in terms of moving, so that ultimately, like I would have said before in my talk, that the embracing of Obeah or embracing of Afrocentric practices or spirituality in that way is not something to talk about. It's something to be done. We have to be in the process of the doing. And in the doing, we allow ourselves to be deepened, so that we can come to other senses of understanding, other senses of knowing, other senses of thinking, other senses of sensing, other sense of being, to really push for the oral, not only listening, but not only speaking, but also feeling the narrative. Able to really embrace that part of ourselves that has been denied us because of the way our ancestors were treated. To me, Obeah, opening yourself to that concept and to take Dr. Murray's words to reconnect those fragments is the beginning of a reconstruction, but also the beginning of a re-emergence or a renewed reality that we might be able to embrace as we move further away from the trauma of slavery and colonization. Those are my thoughts.
John. Right, thank you, John, for that. Tara.
Okay, hi. Thank you. I think one of the great things about this discussion is that in opening and having to open it up online, we've had so many different perspectives shared from many different places, and particularly across the region. And one of the things that I have found, especially in teaching my students, when I teach a course called The History of Medicine in the Caribbean, and when I first used to bring up Obeah, even more so than Voodoo or Santeria, as an African space for healing in the Caribbean, I used to have students shrink in their seats and not even want to even discuss the term. And that was a decade ago, maybe let's say now. Now it's very different. Now there's a more of an acceptance that perhaps this was a space that we did not have access to or could fully embrace. And there's a curiosity and there's an appreciation that people want to learn more and know more. And I think by creating these spaces for discussion, we are acknowledging that there is that need, and there is that need for people to understand that this is very much a place, a space, even in its secrecy, that they can access knowledge about themselves and especially knowledge about the past. And I think that it is very healing for people. I think there's also a kind of, for me, it's an access to a feminine part of my knowledge systems that I've gained from my own grandmother, for example. So things that sometimes I just have strands of things she used to say, or herbs that she used to use, or practices that she had. And now they kind of come together, or they can come together in my mind a lot easier, because I feel like I can appreciate this knowledge a little bit more. So as long as we're creating these kinds of spaces, and as long as the spaces are safe, and hopefully they are safe now, I don't know, in our kind of current anti-Blackness struggles across the world, but we do need to speak to each other more. We need to record more. We need to privilege the knowledge of all of the different groups in our society. So one of the things we didn't get to talk about here today is that, the number of St. Vincentians and St. Lucians in our society in Barbados right now has also caused a bit of a resurgence in ideas around Obeah and these kinds of practices and beliefs, and as Deryck says, technologies. And that is changing and shaping or reshaping our own knowledge and our ability to touch that space. So I think there's a lot of opportunity here, but we do have to have very safe spaces in order to discuss this knowledge as well.
Yeah, Tari, I do agree with you. I mean, and I would like to think that the museum, by utilizing our space, becomes one of those safe spaces in which to discuss this. I know that Deryck is doing this in his practice with the Center for Hybrid Studies as that space as well. But for me, for the museum, it's in a way, should I say, part of that decolonizing activity, in which we privilege the narratives and ideologies and belief systems that for so long have remained hidden or have had to mask because of a certain degree of stigmatization. And that having a forum like this and continuing these discussions, we open ourselves to acceptance and tolerance, but also understanding and a different way in which we view and interact with the world around us and with ourselves. On that note, this is the last question, but someone did mention, what would it look like if we were to in fact really decolonize? What would our weekly routine or annual calendar look like, knowing that right now our current systems center around Christian knowledge systems, i.e. Sundays and Christmas? I found that a very interesting question, and Deryck is smiling. If anyone wants to tackle that, and after that we go into any closing remarks from our panelists.
Yeah, well, I don't know if I can say exactly what it would look like. I mean, that's the entire point that I think John was making, that we have to be open to what novelty, what original constructs we will come up with as we decolonize. My only caution is not to think of decolonization as, sort of a purification. I don't know that we can go in and extract anything that has already been mixed and assimilated. I think that we can become aware of the various strands of our heritage. And we can, I like to use the term reorchestrate. I think of orchestras and conductors reorchestrating from the ground up what it is we want to identify with, and while excavating knowledge that that we should have. I'll dovetail that into my wrap up. And so I want to say, if we don't leave here thinking with anything else, that we often underestimate what we lost in the transition from Africa to the Caribbean, in terms of knowledge, in terms of ideas, in terms of philosophy. And, you know, I think that we need to take that, because hidden within our spirituality is our technology. And when I say technology, I'm not just speaking about spiritual spirits and so on. I'm speaking about, you know, things that science, concepts that science grapples with at the moment. You know, what is consciousness? You know, what's the best construct for a society? Those are some of the fundamental issues that we still need, even though we have, you know, our Western technology has gone from the nuclear bomb to handheld devices for communication and so on. There's still fundamental questions to be answered. And I think our contribution that we can continue to make, because we've been making the contribution all along, would be to help work out what does our reality. You know, there's a French philosopher, Bergson, who said that there really should have been two sciences, because he considered Western science to be studying the dead, because Western scientists stop things in their track to study them. Everything in nature they stop and then study. So he considered that to be studying things that are dead. He considered it to be a graveyard, a thanatocracy. Whereas he didn't say, he said it should have been two sciences, one like that, but one that studied the living things in their flow, reality in its flow while it is flowing. And he didn't say African tradition, but it is clear to me that African traditions, African spiritual traditions, is precisely what he was saying we should have had as another science. And so I want to suggest that Western science is a science of manipulating materiality, whereas African spirituality, including Obeah, is a science of communication. How do you communicate and commune with nature? And I would like us to, because I'm speaking as not only a scientist or somebody with a science background, not a practicing scientist, a bit of a historian and an Orisha priest, that there are important gems of knowledge that has been submerged and hidden that we need to take out, polish, and deploy for our future civilization. I want to make one clarification, Kevin. When I said plays, when Jamaicans and Surinamese say plays in referring to their African rituals, they were not using the word play to mask the deeper ritual. It's just that was the English word that they used. It wasn't like how the saints are intended to mask the Orishas in Santeria. It was, they were actually doing the actual rituals in the open, and they call them, it's just that they call them plays. And so thank you, I want to say thank you to everybody who came. I really enjoyed the seminar, and like many people in the chat are saying now, challenge the Barbados Museum and Historical Society to immediately start planning the next one, so we can get some more interesting perspectives. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Murray. Dr. Inniss and then Dr. Hunte.
Hi, Kevin. I think I said what I needed to say because I thought the previous comments were the wrap-up comments. But I do want to reiterate my thanks for all of the participants here who have stuck with us for the last 2 hours to explore this issue. And yeah, I look forward to the next one.
Dr. Hunt.
Like Tara, I thought that the last comment was the last, but I do want to take this opportunity to thank the Barbados Museum and Historical Society for offering me. I was very humbled by the gesture. I was very glad to be on a panel with Dr. Inniss and Dr. Murray. Looking forward to maybe more conversations like this. And I would invite our people to really look at this, what I would call Obeah project, this decolonization project, as one where we get to challenge the systems that we have been conditioned to believe are true, and to really look at what is underneath, and to maybe embrace that what is underneath is what always was, and that once we tap into that, we can shift our perspective to be more inclusive, to be more diverse, to be more, engaging, to really think about communicating and aligning rather than dividing and remaining exclusive. And that is actually what our reality is, and not what we have been taught to present as our spirituality or our religion. So, and Obeah, we can, like how we in the Caribbean, we take a word, make the word, use the word to celebrate ourselves. We could consider that as a possibility.
Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you very much for being with us for the last 2 hours. Looking in the chat, I've gotten persons from around the region as far as the United Kingdom, the USA, and St. Croix. We are coming out of this discussion, be planning our second panel. I want to thank our panelists with sharing with everyone their research. I think that this is the beginning for a wonderful exploration of Obeah and taking a deeper look into what underpins some of our cultural practices and how we can look to inculcate and use them more openly in our societies. At this juncture, I want to wish everyone a fantastic weekend and thank you very much for joining us. Until next time, have a very safe weekend. Bye.
Thank you.
Right. Okay, thank you.